What's with this plain-looking dish? Jim's wife Annie, with a mocking laugh, stirred the stew with a spoon. She didn't bring it to her mouth. It's as if she's just toying with it. Jim's face turned red as he clenched his fists, looking at Annie. I was a mix of anger towards Annie and worry for Jim, confused and unsure of what to do. But then, a person who suddenly appeared made Annie freeze. You are cut off. Never come back. With that forceful voice, the counterattack from me and Jim began. I am Melissa, 70 years old. I live with my husband Scott and our son Jim. A few years ago, our daughter lived with us too, but she got married and moved out. Jim is turning 40 this year. I wish he could find someone great, like his sister did, and be happy. But Jim, he's never been much for romance. I'm not exactly a ladies' man. It's not that I don't want to marry, but I don't want to force it, he'd say casually. Despite our worries as parents, he does things at his own pace. Jim has a steady job. He's got a calm personality, right? He may not be handsome, but he's clean and presentable, I'd say when discussing Jim. Scott would laugh awkwardly at this. Well, I get why you're worried, but if it's meant to be, he'll marry eventually. He says he doesn't want to force it, right? Yeah, I guess so, I'd reply somewhat reluctantly. Then one day, a matchmaking opportunity came out of the blue for Jim. It was Scott who brought it up. The potential match was the daughter of Scott's friend. Scott had run into his friend Kent while out and about. They realized in their chat that both their children were single. Why not let them meet? Scott agreed, and the introduction was arranged. She's Jim's age, 40. She's been focused on her career so far, not interested in marriage. If she's never been interested before, I wonder if it'll work with Jim. He's not exactly eager to marry either. While I was thankful for the introduction, I couldn't help but feel it might just be the parents getting excited. If that was the case, it would be a waste of time. But actually, she started looking for a partner this year. When I mentioned Jim, she seemed quite interested. Really? It seemed odd to suddenly want to marry at 40. I had my doubts, but when I asked Jim, he agreed to meet her, saying, I'll meet her at least. The day of the introduction arrived. We decided to have dinner together at a restaurant. The woman was wearing a beautiful dress and greeted us with a bright smile. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry for my father's insistence. My name is Annie. Not strikingly beautiful, but clean-looking. Most importantly, she always had a smile which made a good impression. She was also good at making conversation, which helped the typically quiet Jim. She's a wonderful girl, Jim. Back home after the meal, Scott was clearly smitten. Yeah, she's nice, agreed Jim. I too thought Annie was a lovely girl. That night we got a call from them. Annie likes Jim, so we were thinking maybe they could date with marriage in mind. That's wonderful. Jim feels the same way. And so their relationship began. Things seemed to go smoothly, and within a month they started talking about marriage. Annie began visiting our home during their courtship. There were a few concerns, but things progressed well, and 3 months after their meeting, they got married. We all laughed about the quick marriage, but I think that was when I should have realized something. Marriage changes people. This is true for both men and women, but with Annie, the change was striking. Melissa, I'm taking this with me. After marrying, Annie would regularly visit our house and take home the food I had prepared. This happened occasionally before they were married. Annie, like I said before, it's a bit, to just open the fridge without asking. All right, you mentioned it was embarrassing. Don't worry about it. It's messy, sure, but we're family, so it's fine, Annie would say, brazenly rummaging through. Once or twice was bearable, but soon her visits increased from monthly to weekly, and now it's every 2 or 3 days. She'd even take the dinner I'd prepared for that day. Annie, could you maybe give us a heads up next time? Like, when you're planning to come over? If we knew she was coming, we could prepare. That's what I thought when I said it. But Annie just looked at me blankly. I can't tell. It depends on how work goes and how I feel. I might plan to come in the morning, but then feel like eating out in the evening. Such a free spirit. According to Jim, since getting married, Annie hardly ever cooked. Maybe she's not good at it. Jim and Annie both work, so maybe she's just too busy. Trying to be helpful, I offered, if you want, I can come over and cook. Just tell me what you want and I'll do my best. I thought it was better than her just taking food without asking, but that didn't go over well. Annie glared at me, slamming a plastic container down on the table. What is that? Such a condescending attitude. Just because you can cook a little, you think you're so great. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Never mind, if you're going to be such a hassle, I don't need your food. Excuse me. Annie? I called out, but she left, stomping loudly. After that, Annie stopped visiting our house. Did I do something wrong? When I mentioned it to Scott, he sighed, looking troubled. Well, you probably said it wrong. To upset sweet Annie like that. Sweet? Scott said that, and I had thought so too when I first met her. But Annie changed over time. She stopped pretending around me. No more smiles, only sighs and even eye rolls in my presence. Maybe that's just who she really is. She once laughed and said, Melissa, you're like a typical grandma. I can't believe I managed to keep my cool. Strangely, she remained nice in front of Scott. I always hear about Scott from my dad. She'd say a whole octave higher, giggling. Scott was clearly pleased, smiling. She's really a good, honest girl. So when I brought up Annie's behavior, it was seen as mere jealousy. Maybe when things cool down, she'll come over again and you can apologize then. Annie will understand. But why should I be the one to apologize? While I nodded silently, agreeing with Scott, Annie didn't show up for another 2 months. During this time, Jim, who had been busy with work and seeing less of Annie, finally came to visit. I was shocked when I saw him. Jim, what happened to you? Jim, who used to be on the plumper side, had lost a noticeable amount of weight. It's okay, just been busy with work, he said with a weak smile, but he never used to lose weight no matter how busy he was. Are you eating properly? It's a hassle to prepare food. I've just been snacking on bread. Bread? Doesn't Annie care seeing Jim like this? She supposedly had a job with relatively flexible hours. Doesn't Annie say anything? She seems busy too. His detached way of speaking was concerning. Busy? Her own husband is like this, and she says nothing. I grabbed Jim's hand and he trembled. Then he slumped into a chair, looking like he might cry at any moment. Jim? Mom, the truth is... Jim began to slowly open up. I covered my mouth in shock at his story. That's unforgivable. I was trembling with anger. I didn't want to worry you, but I feel relieved now. Jim managed a small relieved smile. What do you plan to do now, Jim? I think I want a divorce. I even talked to Dad about it, but he said I'm just immature. Scott's being deceived by Annie. It sounded like something Scott, who doesn't know Annie's true nature, would say. I had to expose Annie for who she really is. But first, we need to get your health back. Take this with you. Can you come over tomorrow? Yeah, thanks. From that day, Jim started stopping by our house every day after work. At first, he hardly ate, but gradually, he started eating more. I wish he'd eat more. Maybe he likes stew, his favorite since he was little. Jim always had a favorite dish. This stew. It takes about a week to prepare due to the slow cooking. I hadn't made it recently because it's a bit of a hassle. I hope he'll eat it. I gazed at the pot full of stew, filled with hope. A week later, when the stew was ready, I called Jim, and I could hear his joy over the phone. He happened to be off work that day and said he'd come right over. I waited leisurely for Jim. An hour later, I heard the front door open. Jim! I stood up to greet him. But it wasn't Jim who walked in. It was Annie. Annie, what are you doing here? Long time no see. Annie smiled, looked around, and laughed. As always, you seem to have a lot of free time. What brings you here today? Oh, Jim seems happy about something. When I asked, he mentioned something about a special stew. Thought I might as well have some too. Annie walked over to the stove and opened the pot's lid. Is this it? Yes, that's it. As I responded, Annie laughed and said, What's this? Way too much. While I was puzzled, Jim burst in with a rush. Annie, cut it out! What? This is what Jim was so excited about, right? I just wanted to see what it was. That's okay, right, Melissa? I, prompted by Annie, poured some stew into a bowl and handed it to her. Annie slowly brought the spoon to her mouth, then laughed mockingly after swallowing. What's this bland dish? Annie? Come on, it's tasteless. The vegetables are too soft and it looks unappealing. Jim, this is what you were looking forward to? Jim's face turned beet red, fists clenched. I was a mix of anger towards Annie and worry for Jim, unsure of what to do. Annie stirred the stew with a mean smirk. I heard it was Melissa's special dish, so I had high expectations. What a letdown. What's a letdown? The next moment, a figure appeared in the kitchen, making Annie freeze. Scott? Scott glared at Annie, snatched the spoon and bowl from her, and then loudly declared, You are cut off. Never come back. What? Annie looked around confused. Wait, why? I thought you were out for dinner with my dad today. Things changed. I've been home all day. Annie looked momentarily caught off guard, then frowned and covered her face. I'm sorry. I've been feeling cold from Melissa and Jim lately and just said things I didn't mean. Annie continued, her voice quivering, making excuses to Scott. I came today looking forward to it for myself. I requested fancy dishes, but Melissa made this plain food, as if to say I don't deserve better. How could you keep lying like that? I never said I made this for you. See, she's saying I deserve such a dish. Annie started crying loudly as if to deceive. Scott moved in front of Annie and said quietly, Melissa made this as harassment for you? Yes. Annie nodded, still covering her face. Scott took a deep breath and shouted, Don't lie. Melissa made this lovingly for Jim, for his health, because he has been wasting away because of you. Annie looked up at Scott, tears absent. It's my fault? Yes, it is. You. Scott, calm down. I interjected, soothing an angry Scott. Annie's been busy, right? Looking for a next partner. I said with a smile, and Annie glared at me, twisting her mouth in disbelief. Jim's salary wasn't as much as you expected, so you've been busy looking for your next marriage prospect, right? Annie quickly looked at Jim. Yes, this was the story I heard from Jim that day. Apparently, Annie was terribly disappointed when she learned about Jim's salary soon after they got married. And she said to Jim, there's no point in being married like this. It's not my fault if Jim was a disappointment. I thought he was in a better position. That's no excuse for cheating. Annie laughed mockingly and crossed her arms. I haven't done anything yet. You have no proof, so stop making false accusations. We have plenty of proof, I said. What? Annie looked at Jim, who nodded firmly. You might not know this, Annie, but I've been working from home in my room. What? Annie's face drained of color. She didn't know because they had stopped talking. Jim had been working from home for a while. Annie, unaware, had been busy pursuing affairs. I always thought you were bold, but bringing your lover to our house, that's just shocking. Annie tried to deny it. No, that's not true. That person, he's just... You can make excuses, but it's pointless. Everything's been recorded. Recorded? Annie collapsed to the floor, holding her head. This was the main reason Jim had lost weight. Discovering Annie's infidelity. He couldn't confront her, just quietly gathered evidence. That's terrible. How could you do this? Whether it was the shock of being discovered or the recording, or both, Annie started crying. Always playing the victim. Do you think that'll solve everything? As I approached Annie inside, she turned to me. But recording, that's too much. You as a woman should understand, Melissa. Annie grabbed my hand, looking up at me. Right, Melissa? Well, I wouldn't know. I've been married for 45 years and never had to worry about being recorded by my husband. I brushed off Annie's hand and she bit her lip, frustrated. Then she turned to Scott as her next target. Scott, I'm sorry. I've reflected on my actions. Please, for my father's sake, let's settle this quietly. I'm not the one you should be apologizing to, and your father isn't involved in this. But you're close friends with my father, right? Annie looked up at Scott, trying to evoke sympathy with teary eyes. Scott frowned and muttered, Poor Kent. To think his 40-year-old daughter would be so clueless. What did you say? Scott sighed and shook his head. Kent and I have already discussed this. He apologized and told us to do as we please. So, what now? Annie's head drooped to the floor. Scott glanced at me, then looked away troubled. I couldn't believe it when you told me, but Annie's acting skills are quite something. Hard to believe, I know. Annie remained slumped over. I addressed her. Don't worry, you have a job. You can pay the compensation. Compensation? Yes. Even though it was a short marriage, it's still marriage. And while remarriage might be tough, you'll be fine. Just take good care of your parents as their only child. She should pay the compensation, take care of her parents, and remain single. It's harsh, but considering what she did to Jim and me, a little bitterness is justified. Annie was too stunned to even lift her head from the floor. Oh, and one last thing. Jim just got promoted. His salary is going up next month. Might not meet your standards, though. Really? This news made Annie quickly raise her head. Perhaps the thought of Jim's impending promotion, despite their planned divorce, was upsetting to her. Annie was muttering something under her breath, tears streaming down her face. Guess I'll have to leave it to Kent then. Scott contacted Kent, asking him to come pick up Annie. Kent arrived shortly to take her away. Enough, come on. Annie, stop it. No, Daddy, do something. I still want Jim. You're friends, right? Tell him, please. Annie was screaming in near hysteria. It was unfortunate for my husband's friend who had to handle this, but it was necessary. It's all your fault. You've even troubled my friend. You still don't understand what you did. I won't help you anymore. But Dad, I'm sorry, please. Annie continued to cry and scream until the very end, and my husband's friend repeatedly apologized to Scott and us before leaving. After Annie and her father left, Scott apologized to both me and Jim. I believe she was a good, respectable woman because she was Kent's daughter. I should have listened to you more. I'm sorry. Given Annie's convincing act, I could somewhat understand Scott's feelings. But I wished he had believed us. Yes, it's important to listen first. Of course. He promised to be more attentive in the future, so we decided to forgive him. Later on, Jim and Annie divorced. Annie opposed it strongly, but Kent's friend persuaded her. Annie quit her job and is now working at a B&B in the mountains, living in as a helper. It's a traditional place with strict yet warm-hearted people, and Kent's friend hoped this environment would change Annie. She calls daily, crying and wanting to come home, but somehow he's managing to encourage her. Jim is back to his old self, not much interested in women, and working at his own pace. He's regained his former health and looks well. I may not have understood the benefits of marriage, but I've reappreciated the value of family. His words made me feel a bit bashful. Both my husband and I have learned to listen more to others. Whether Jim finds someone in the future is unknown, but we decided not to interfere unnecessarily. As long as Jim is happy, that's what matters most.